Pac-Man is a character who has many different designs over the years, probably more so than any other video game character combined. However, because of this, he's bound to have some character designs that either have specific changes that personally polarize me, or have very little to do with the spirit of Pac-Man as a character. Which is why I decided to make a list talking about what I think are the 5 worst Pac-Man designs I've ever seen. Some of these picks might stir up some controversy, but I'll try to explain my issues and criticisms the best I possibly can, and feel free to comment if you agree or disagree with any of my thoughts. Let's start the list off with some honorable mentions. These Pac-Man designs have things that kinda bother me, but not too much where it becomes a problem. Let's start off with 2600 Pac-Man, seen on the box and instructions for Pac-Man on the Atari 2600. I think some people might consider this design to be the worst for the sole reason for its association with the 2600 port of Pac-Man, but ignoring the below averageness of that port, the design used for the artwork is very passable. Something about his design makes him kinda cute. The rosy cheeks, the way he smiles, and while I normally dislike seeing Pac-Man with sclera eyes, I like how the artist paid attention to the original design, but kept the pie eyes for his pupils. It's not an exact copy of Pac-Man's original design, but it doesn't have to be as long as it still retains what made Pac-Man's design so great. 2 Pac-Man, from Pac-Man 2 The New Adventures. I'm not sure why Namco Home Tech decided to rename Hello Pac-Man to Pac-Man 2 in North America, but they did. Look, I haven't really played this game, but at least I can talk about Pac-Man's design from that game. More specifically his sprite, because while he looks fairly normal in the game's artwork, his in-game sprite, well, he just makes some of the most unsettling faces I've ever seen on Pac-Man. But despite this, I think it makes him look pretty expressive. Party Pac-Man, from Pac-Man Party. His design is very similar to another design of Pac-Man, but I'm gonna wait until I get around to covering that other design. Tengen Pac-Man, from the Tengen release of Pac-Man on the NES. He's pretty much just the Hanna-Barbera design of Pac-Man, however there's something just a bit unsettling about the way it's drawn though. Maybe it's the shading, maybe it's the blue irises the artist added, maybe it's how small his face is, or it could also just be his expression. It looks like the artist was trying to make him look like a face the HB version would make, but it just looks off in a way. Here's the comparison of this design to the HB design we're more familiar with. It doesn't bother me too much to put on the list, and I actually do like the HB design it's based on. Pop Pac-Man, from Pac-Man Pop. There was a short-lived mobile game that was pretty much Puzzle Bobble but with a Pac-Man skin. I actually remember playing it when it came out and I actually thought it was enjoyable. Well, at least until you lose all your lives and you have to pay to keep playing. This game was noteworthy for me because it marked the first time they sorta brought back the iconic classic design of the character. As for the design itself, it's a bit stylized. He does look a bit unsettling with those circle-shaped eyes and the lack of nose, but I think it looks alright, though I do understand why some people might be put off by it. Arcade Pack Pac-Man, from the cover of Namco Museum Arcade Pack for the Nintendo Switch. I don't really mind the Namco characters in these stylized designs, I like how unique they look. However, it's probably Pac-Man that got the worst makeover. I feel like he wouldn't look so terrifying if it weren't for those sclera eyes. In my opinion, you should never give Pac-Man sclera eyes, and this design alone pretty much explains it all. Everything else is fine, it's just the eyes that ruin it for me. So that was pretty much the honorable mentions. So now let's get to what I think are the 5 worst designs of Pac-Man. Wreck-It Ralph is a Disney movie released in 2012, and it's honestly and unironically one of Disney's best and most underappreciated animated features. Anyways, it all started when I was fast-forwarding a DVR recording of Gravity Falls on Disney Channel. At some point where I was fast-forwarding, I thought I saw Bowser for a quick second, so I went back to see if I did see Bowser, and that was when I found a trailer for Wreck-It Ralph. I was really excited that Bowser was in the film, but seeing Pac-Man as Clyde in the trailer made me so excited that Pac-Man will be in this film. This was around the time I started to become the huge Pac-Man fan I am today, so while I wasn't so sure if Pac-Man himself was going to be in the film, I expected him to since the ghosts were present. And when I finally saw the film, I was really happy to see Pac-Man on screen. Oh.
Pac-Man? They invented Pac-Man? That cherry-chasing dot muncher isn't even part of this game!
Don't get me wrong, the joke Ralph made was great and all, but after the novelty wore off, I couldn't help but find Pac-Man's design to be nothing more than a big letdown for what is otherwise part of a fantastic film. Just for further context, at the time, I mainly knew Pac-Man from this design, so I expected Pac-Man to look something more like his 2D or 3D designs he had in most of the 2000s. But no, they used his in-game Wedge design, which I can understand why they did this. Not only is Wedge Pac-Man the most iconic and original design, but also the fact that the character designs in the movie are closer to their in-game sprites. You could clearly see this with Clyde and the other ghosts, but the same thing applies to Figar's eyes being on each side, Taizo Hori's face being blue, the Cuber characters liking toes, just to name a few. I can respect Rich Moore for wanting to make these classic characters stay true to their in-game sprites, though I think you really lose something with the Pac-Man design they chose for the movie. Pac-Man being in his more iconic wedge design wouldn't have been a big issue for me if his eyes weren't just single dots on each side. I think it just looks lazy and boring. The Pac-Man merchandise from around the time always have him in his in-game wedge design, but they gave him his iconic pie eyes that the original artwork was known for. Why couldn't they just have used this design for the wedge if they couldn't use the superior ball with limbs design? In Ralph Breaks the Internet, Pac-Man gets some more screen time than he did in the first, maybe even more so than Cuber and Sonic. Sadly, he still uses the same disappointing wedge with the dotted eyes, though his eyes are a little bigger and much closer, so I guess it's some sort of improvement. Though I still would have preferred if he had the pie eyes. Even Pixels, a film that was universally panned unlike the Ralph films, at least got his design right. Not only that, but there was a special mobile Pac-Man game loosely based on Ralph Breaks the Internet, but what's even more interesting was that there was a series of figurines that let you unlock things from that game. All the figurines they made were characters from the film, as well as the Disney princesses. However, Pac-Man himself was able to get his own figurine, and guess what? He uses his official wedge design with the pie eyes instead of those stupid dots he has in the actual film. Not only is Pac-Man the only non-Disney owned video game character to actually have merchandise related to the Ralph films, but even the design of this figurine does the character more justice than the films ever could. This does make sense since these figurines were made by Bandai and they're owned by Bandai Namco, but I digress. If the Ralph films were able to use the modern designs for Sonic and Dr. Eggman despite their game in the film actually being Sonic the Fighters, which actually featured the classic designs, not the modern ones, I don't see why they couldn't have just used Pac-Man's more popular ball with limbs design. And even if they didn't want to, at least give the wedge design the pie eyes. I mean, like seriously, why didn't they do that? Out of all the designs we're going to be looking at, this Pac-Man design is probably the most controversial one on this list. Do you know what makes Pac-Man such a great character design? It's that his design is very simple and timeless. Round yellow body, big black mouth, pie eyes, sometimes he has a nose. Well, what if you take those aspects of the character and add some unnecessary details that ruin the appeal of the character? Well, you get Paxter from Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures. Don't get me wrong, Paxter himself is a decent character and his design is fine. I mean, it fits the whole world of Ghostly Adventures, but compared to his most official designs, he kinda sucks and blows actually. I'm gonna say this again, but I personally think you should never give Pac-Man sclera eyes. It just makes him more creepy and less appealing. Rarely have any of these designs ever worked with these eyes, and Ghostly Adventures Pac is no exception. At least they kept his pupils pie-eyed. His shoes aren't quite as simple as the original's boots, though since this is a younger version of Pac-Man, I can see why they went with these sneakers. Not to mention that the sneakers do somewhat fit since Pac-Man is usually running constantly. Also, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I actually don't think the teeth he has are all that bad. Honestly, I think Pac-Man having visible teeth is pretty fitting since he eats a lot. There's a fan edit that someone made that edits Paxter's design to the more iconic old school Pac-Man look. I think this fan edit really shows how flawed Ghostly Adventures Pac-Man is design-wise. Even his design from Pac-Man Party makes a better Pac-Man design than the creature he devolved into. I never minded the party design as much because despite having the same flaws, he at least has a more vibrant color palette, and that Party's art style isn't as cookie cutter as Ghostly Adventures is. It also didn't help that Bandai Namco at the time considered this Pac-Man to be the main Pac-Man, which meant that these guys were mostly retired for a few years while this kid was what we were supposed to refer to as Pac-Man. Honestly, as much as I actually enjoyed the Ghostly Adventures and wish it got a 4th season, I can't help but find Paxter's design to be a bit of a departure. It always bothered me as a kid to the point where just seeing his face pisses me off. And unlike Chuck E. Cheese, Bandai Namco eventually learned from their mistakes and brought the main classic Pac-Man designs back for good. I think Pac from the Ghostly Adventures is a great example of how a modern redesign of a simple, timeless character can sometimes go very wrong. Pat McMahon was an artist at Bally Midway who made his own interpretation of Pac-Man for the Mr. and Mrs. Pac-Man pinball machine, merchandise, promotional material, and those hilariously bad kid stuff records. And wow, what a treat they are. Honestly, I can respect Pat for what he was trying to go for. I think he was probably basing the designs off of those classic vintage movie snack characters you see at the drive-in movies, which I think is very cool if you think about. I think this art style could easily fit Pac-Man's character since his original design was after all based off of classic rubber hose characters. However, in execution, well, I mean, Pat is a great artist, I'm not saying he's terrible by any means, but I feel like he went a little overboard with this design. I don't know why Pac-Man has such big elbows and knees. His face is especially off-putting. His nose is way too small, his cheeks fall into the uncanny valley. I think the only thing that works here would probably be his eyes. They actually don't look as bad as some of the other designs that use the sclera eyes, and they do keep the pie eyes for his pupils. He also has giant Mickey Mouse shoes instead of boots. Sometimes they're white, while others it's the proper red. Pat McMahon did at least improve his Pac-Man design later on. There's this piece of artwork, which was used for a calendar as well as for licensing purposes. But you could really tell he was starting to improve. His eyebrows are pointed like the classic Namco design, his eyes are more like the Hanna-Barbera cartoon, and he doesn't have those big cheeks. Pat was also the co-artist on Baby Pac-Man, in which the character designs for that game are even better. Pac-Man only has like one appearance on the cabinet, but he looks much closer to his proper Namco design besides his tiny nose and rounder eyebrows. Honestly, I appreciate what this design was going for, it's just not my cup of tea. Atari released ports of Pac-Man on their home computers, such as the Atari 400 and Atari 800. And if you thought the Ghostly Adventures Pac-Man had a bad design, well, say hello to Atari 8-bit Pac-Man seen on the covers for Pac-Man for the Atari 400 and 800. This design was actually made by the same guy who did the 2600 Pac-Man design, Hiro Kimura. Yet another example of giving Pac-Man more details not working. Seriously, like, why does Pac-Man have a human body? Where was that in the actual game? The buck teeth, like, I mean, wow. The athletic clothing he wears is pretty fitting. I also like how his wedge design is on his jersey. But still, why the human body? Like, no other Pac-Man design has ever given him a full human body. Pac-Man is pretty much supposed to be a simple face, but here, they gave him a full body and clothes. Like, what was the artist thinking with this design? Did he think his in-game sprite was just a head with a body underneath? However, it's not quite as bad as I initially thought, oddly enough. For starters, I actually think his face looks kinda cute. Despite being so different from the Pac-Man we know, at least his face doesn't look nearly as unsettling compared to, say, McMahon Pac-Man. I also mentioned that the athletic clothing does actually fit Pac-Man's running nature, and honestly, we could have gotten a much worse design compared to this one. Before they settle on this artwork for the 8-bit family port, they originally planned on using this for the cover for the 2600 port. Man, I'm really glad this was changed because how is this artwork appropriate for Pac-Man? I also think it looks way too scary for the game's target audience. Like, how would this entice women or 6 to 12-year-olds to go out and buy the game? Ignoring the horrors of what I think are supposed to be the ghosts, Pac-Man's design on the rejected artwork is pretty much the same as the Atari 8-bit Pac-Man. Except he's chrome for some reason. Like, who thought it was a good idea to make him chrome? What was Kimura thinking when he initially drew this? Thankfully, this artwork was rejected, and while the design was revisited for the 8-bit family ports, at least he made him yellow this time. Honestly, with all the Pac-Man designs we mentioned, even if I don't like them, I still have to give them props for trying to stay true to Pac-Man's original design in one way or another. Whether it be Wreck-It Ralph Pac-Man for being his in-game wedge design, Ghostly Adventures and McMahon Pac-Man for being based off of the classic Namco design, and even Atari 8-bit Pac-Man, despite being a literal person, still fits the athletic nature of Pac-Man. The same cannot be said for the last one I'll cover. I actually don't have a strong hatred for the other designs I talked about despite them thinking they're the worst, but I kinda do with the next one. Atari 8-bit Pac-Man's design is more baffling and ridiculous, but at least he has some aspects that stay true to the character. But this next design, well... I can easily call Midway Pac-Man the worst design of the character. There are just so many things about this design that are so wrong. In-game, Pac-Man is a yellow ball with a large mouth. When it was time to make the original game's artwork, Namco went with this design, drawn by Tadashi Yamashita. It was cute, happy, playful, exciting, but the long nose, the pie eyes, the pointed eyebrows gave off a lot of personality. It had a simple, cute, yet timeless feel to the character. The whole point of Pac-Man was to appeal to women, and this design was perfect for its target audience. And then Midway saw this design and decided no, they didn't want him to be cute and timeless, so they allegedly hired Gordon Morrison to redraw the cabinet, including the characters. I know Americanizing a Japanese character was pretty common back in the 80s and 90s, after all, it was important to make sure that the game would be successful in the North American market. But the design of Pac-Man they went with, like, does this even look like Pac-Man? There are two main problems I have with this design. The first is how it barely resembles either the in-game sprite or Yamashita's design. Pac-Man is a pixelated round yellow ball with a large mouth, yet this design does not look round at all. Yamashita's Namco design gave him black pie eyes, which not only gave him a classic cartoon look, but also implemented the in-game wedge design into the artwork. Meanwhile, this one has giant red eyes, or blue eyes on the control panel, and while the pupils are pie-eyed, they're so tiny you could barely even tell. I know I sound naive asking this since my parents were literally children when the original game came out, but how is this design supposed to appeal to women, let alone grab the attention of 6 to 12-year-olds? I was in the target audience when I played Pac-Man for the first time on Namco Muse M64, and the classic 2D and sprite designs really grabbed my attention. When I first saw an image of what the original arcade cabinet looked like when I became a super fan, I was so confused on what I was looking at. This yellow blob, with red eyes and long feet. That's supposed to be Pac-Man? You know, Pac-Man. This yellow ball with a big mouth. The original Namco design felt like a great attempt at turning this simple yellow wedge into a full-fledged style character. He was round like the wedge, he had a large mouth like the wedge, and his eyes are literally shaped like the wedge. And all the creative liberties that Yamashita took, like the limbs, gloves, and boots, they made the character stand out as a simple yet effective design that perfectly fits what Pac-Man stood for, not just the character but the game as a whole. Midway Pac-Man is pretty much none of those things. I guess he is still simple, but I think he's way too simplified. Which leads me to my second main problem with Midway Pac-Man, his lack of personality. If you look at the upright cabinet that Namco released in Japan, the artwork on the cabinet had so much personality. Almost all the artwork of Pac-Man was unique and original, and gave off a better impression of what the actual game was like. Whether it be Pac-Man running or eating a power pellet, he was a lot more expressive. Sure, some people might think the art on the Japanese cabinet is distracting or too busy, but I don't really see the problem here since you would have been more likely to play it in a dimly lit arcade. The Midway one makes the exact same smirk on his stupid face, and that's pretty much it. He doesn't make any other expression. What you see is what you get. Which is a shame because I love the yellow and black color scheme the US cabinet has. It's the artwork that ruins it for me. Now, with some alterations, could Midway Pac-Man even work as a Pac-Man design? Honestly, yeah, and guess what? We have an idea on what it would have looked like. Meet Irexa Pac-Man, a version of Pac-Man from the Spanish arcade release of Pac-Man. For those who don't know, Midway licensed their arcade games to a company called Irexa for the Spanish market. The Irexa Spanish machines are based on Midway's US machines, and wow, they actually did it. They made the Midway design of Pac-Man actually tolerable. Bravo to the artist who made this. This Pac-Man is round, like his in-game sprite. His eyes aren't ridiculously huge, and his pupils are slightly larger. He's still not very expressive, every artwork of him is still more or less the same, but at least he looks a bit more friendlier and, in my opinion, more appealing. In fact, I think the overall artwork on the Spanish cabinet is actually better than the US cabinet. The side art has the actual maze in the background, the marquee has a border with the fruit on each corner. Even the art on the bezel feels more related to the game than whatever the US was supposed to be. I get that the US cabinet's art might have been rushed, but honestly if the US Midway design looked even as decent as the Spanish Irexa design, I probably wouldn't have been too bothered by it. Heck, if Midway would have just kept Namco's artwork but added the yellow and black colors to the cabinet, it still would have been a million, no, billion times better. I mean, they kept most of the original artwork for Rally X, Galaga, and Mappy when they distributed those games in America, so I don't understand why a change like this was even necessary to begin with. Pac-Man would have still been the iconic household name regardless of what they thought of the original design. What makes all this worse is that in modern times, Bandai Namco constantly uses these terrible Midway designs just to pander to nostalgic adults who only care about the first Pac-Man and nothing else. To the point where the Japanese cabinet's artwork has pretty much fallen to obscurity now. Every time Bandai Namco licenses Pac-Man to other licensees, they always use the US Midway designs rather than the original Namco designs that started it all. This crap keeps happening even in Japan, you know, the country that grew up with this cabinet design. Examples include Pac-Man Museum Plus and Pac-Man World Re-Pac, where both the cabinet design and the game borders use the US Midway design. They didn't even have the Japanese Namco cabinet design as an alternate skin. I get that the US cabinet is more iconic and everything, but just because something's more iconic doesn't always mean it's better. While it's great that Pac-Man was able to succeed in the US market and become one of the most iconic and most recognizable video game characters of all time, it's such a shame that Midway had to make such an awful design that almost completely misses the point of what Pac-Man is supposed to be. And because of how nostalgic and iconic the Midway design is nowadays, this design has now overshadowed pretty much every other version of Pac-Man, including this, and especially this. At the end of the day, for every great design a legacy character has, they're bound to at least have a few bad or mediocre designs, and of course, there's also some people who might disagree with me. Maybe there's something in Ghostly Adventures or Midway Pac-Man that speaks to their appeal or sense of style, and that's okay. Honestly, even if I don't agree with every fan's viewpoint, at the same time, it's fun to hear what other people have to say about which version of Pac-Man they enjoy. So what did you think of these Pac-Man designs? Did you agree or at least understand some of my choices? I mean, there were a few hot takes for some. Or do you think I should have included a different Pac-Man design instead? Let me know in the comments below. I'll see you real soon. Same Pac time, same Pac channel.